Okay, so let's try and paint a picture here. Think of a time just buzzing with joie de vivre, incredible progress, undeniable style.
Hmm.
Picture those Parisian boulevards, maybe the Universal Exposition all lit up, or those amazing curvy Art Nouveau buildings.
Yeah, you're talking about the Belle Époque. That period in France, roughly late 19th century up to just before World War I, 1914.
Right. Though the exact start date is a bit fuzzy, isn't it? Some say 1890, others 96, maybe even 1900.
Exactly. But the name itself, Belle Époque, the beautiful era,
Yeah.
that's where things get interesting right away.
Because it sounds so perfect.
Well, yeah. And some people at the time felt it. Octave Mirbeau wrote something like, we live in a beautiful era. France has never been so strong, so great. He really bought into it.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Always. Because if you just scratch the surface, for so many people, it was anything but beautiful. Think grinding poverty, incredibly long working hours, huge inequalities.
So that's the paradox we want to dig into, right? Why did it get this golden age label? And what was the reality hiding underneath? That's what we want to unpack for you in this deep dive, give you a more well-rounded picture.
Definitely is a fascinating period precisely because of those contradictions.
So that name, Belle Époque, you mentioned people didn't actually use it back then.
No, not really. It's what we call a chrononym,
Mm.
a name given afterwards, looking back. People in 1905 weren't strolling around saying, isn't the Belle Époque lovely today?
No, I suppose not. So when did it actually emerge?
It really came about after World War I. I think 1919, 1920, after all that horror and trauma.
Nostalgia, looking back at a seemingly better time.
Exactly. It was this collective yearning for what seemed like a calmer, happier, more stable past, especially compared to the chaos and high cost of living right after the war.
Okay, so it's born from nostalgia. But did it have any basis in reality? Or was it just, wishful thinking?
That's the key question. And historians differ. Someone like Dominic Lejeune argues, yeah, it was embellished, but there was something there.
Like what?
Well, the Third Republic was pretty stable by then. There was real economic energy in certain areas. France had global influence. Science was booming. Intellectual life was vibrant. So not pure fantasy.
Okay, so kernels of truth. But how did it become this almost mythical thing, this romanticized image?
Well, it took a while. Dominique Khalifa actually looked into it and found the term wasn't really used to describe a specific period in the 1920s. It was more like a general phrase, an age of gold.
So when did it properly stick?
Paul Moran's pamphlet 1900 in 1931 sort of kicked off this 1900 craze, defining that specific moment. But the real cementing came later.
Media, radio, film.
You got it. A 1940 radio show called A la Belle Époque, and then a 1946 film, Paris 1900. Those really created this popular image, this imaginaire Parisian of lightness, fun, gaiety.
But not everyone was buying it, even then.
Oh, definitely not. Alfred Sauvy, a famous demographer, called it a reactionary and idiotic myth back in 1965. So there was pushback almost from the start.
And that skepticism makes sense when you look closer, right? Because France was facing challenges even then.
Absolutely. Economically, it was slipping behind Germany and the U.S. It lost its spot as the world's #2 economic power. And demographically, there were serious concerns about population growth, things bubbling under that shiny surface.
Okay, so let's maybe park the economy for a second and look at the politics. You mentioned the Third Republic finding stability. How did that happen?
Well, after some shaky starts like the 1877 crisis or that Boulanger guy stirring things up, the Republic did kind of settle down. There was this growing Republican spirit, and universal male suffrage became, the norm.
And education played a big role here too, didn't it? The ferry laws?
Huge role. The Jules Ferry Laws, 1881-82, free compulsory secular education. That was massive. It basically created this army of state school teachers, like a counter clergy, really pushing back against the church's influence on society.
Wow. And then, of course, the Dreyfus Affair. That must have shaken everything up.
Oh, completely. 1894 to 1906. It tore France apart. But weirdly, it ended up strengthening the Republic. It kind of forced the left-wing groups to unite, solidified the regime.
And figures like Zola, Jacques, that was incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. Intellectuals really found their public voice, using it to demand justice. It was a defining moment.
Which leads us to another massive shift, separating church and state.
Yes, the 1905 law. That officially ended the old Concordat from 1801. It made France definitively secular. Big change. and it caused uproar, especially in some Catholic circles. Some saw it as a persecution, and sadly, it even fueled some anti-Semitic talk, too.
So internally, lots of change, lots of tension. What about France looking outwards? Its empire was growing massively then too, right?
Oh, yeah, aggressively expanding. Indochina, Madagascar annexed in 96, huge chunks of West and Equatorial Africa. The empire grew like 11 times bigger between 1870 and 1914.
Providing resources, markets.
Exactly. But there's a really dark side to that imperial pride.
The human zoos.
Yeah. Shocking, isn't it? At the big universal expositions like Paris 1900, they literally had exhibitions of colonial peoples, promoted this whole idea, this civilizing mission.
Yeah.
It's horrifying to think about now, that contrast between celebrating modernity and these, well, atrocities.
It really is. And diplomatically, still feeling the sting of the defeat by Germany.
Definitely. That revanchist spirit, wanting revenge, was there initially, but pragmatism took over. Crises pushed France into alliances, crucially, with Russia, and then the Entente Cordiale with Britain, setting the stage for, for what came next.
Alliances that would shape the 20th century. And financially, France was still a major player.
Oh, yes. The Paris Bourse, the stock exchange, was right up there with London and Berlin, and French people saved a lot. That money was invested abroad, often strategically, like funding Russian loans to cement that alliance we mentioned, finance and foreign policy hand in hand.
Okay, let's circle back to the economy now, because you said France was slipping. That doesn't quite fit the Golden Age image.
Not really. No, it lost that number 2 spot to Germany and the U.S. By 1914, French industrial output was, less than 6% of the world's total? Germany was making twice as much steel and coal per person.
Why was that? Why the lag?
A big factor was how rural France still was. In 1911, over half the population, 56%, lived in the countryside. Compare that to 38% in Germany. 4 out of 10 French workers were still in agriculture.
So a smaller industrial base.
Yeah, and other things too. A relatively sluggish domestic market because population growth was slow. People tended to save rather than spend. Lots of small family-run businesses that weren't always super productive.
And the culture maybe didn't value industry as much?
That played a part. The ideal of the rentier, just living off investments, was strong. And the education system leaned more towards literature and the classics than, say, engineering or industrial science.
But it wasn't all bad news economically, was it? Weren't there some areas where France was actually leading?
Oh, absolutely. That's the complexity. France excelled in cutting-edge sectors. Take the automobile.
Right. Renault, Peugeot.
Exactly. France was the top car producer in Europe and the world's biggest exporter right up until the war. Production soared 45,000 cars a year by 1913. Louis Renault was a real pioneer.
And aviation, too. Blériot crossing the channel.
Yes, that was huge. Aviation was seen as this daring adventure. Blériot in 1909, Roland Garros crossing the Mediterranean in 1913, captured the public imagination. And there's dynamism in other areas too, textiles, hydroelectric power, aluminum, chemicals. So a mixed picture, but definitely not stagnant everywhere.
Okay, and you mentioned demographic weakness earlier, the depopulation crisis. What was that about?
Well, France's population just wasn't growing like its neighbors. Between 1891 and 1911, it only added about 63,000 people a year. Germany was adding 500,000. Some years, France actually had more deaths than births.
Wow. Why such a low birth rate?
It's complicated. People wanted social mobility, maybe saw fewer kids as helping that. The inheritance laws, the Napoleonic Code, divided property equally, so smaller families kept estates intact. And then there were neo-Malthusian ideas spreading, encouraging smaller families.
So the country was getting older, relatively speaking.
Yes, a higher proportion of elderly people than Germany or Russia.
Yeah.
It was a real national concern. The only thing really boosting the numbers was immigration.
Where from, mainly?
Mostly Italy and Belgium.
Yeah.
By 1911, there were over 1 million foreigners in France, filling some of those gaps.
This really paints that picture of contrasts, doesn't it? Which brings us to society itself. Lejeune said the Belle Époque beauty mostly reflected the bourgeoisie, hiding the misery elsewhere.
That nails it, I think. Yes, overall living standards did improve for many. Food got more varied, people saved a bit more, mail-order catalogs meant better clothes.
But massive gaps remained.
Huge gaps. A working-class family might spend over 60% of their money just on food. A bourgeois family, maybe 20%. Things like transport, holidays, good education. Totally out of reach for most workers. And basic sanitation, running water, sewers, electricity. Many still didn't have it.
And the rural world, still the majority of the population.
Yep, 22 million in 1911. Often living in poverty on small, inefficient farms. You also had this growing group of landless farm workers, a rural proletariat, about 1.7 million by 1910.
Life was tough in the countryside.
Very tough. Wages rose a bit as people left for the cities, but nutrition was often poor, mortality high. And remember that Languedoc wine growers' revolt in 1907? 600,000 people protesting. Shows the deep discontent.
And peasants felt looked down upon.
Oh, definitely. Often mocked by city folk, portrayed badly in books. There was this kind of complex of inferiority. Plus, France was incredibly fragmented geographically. Lots of regional languages and dialects were still spoken. Not everyone was fluent in standard French, a very diverse, uneven country.
And then you have the bourgeoisie on the other side.
Right, a relatively small group, but powerful. Shared values, lifestyle, lots of economic and cultural clout. You had the haute bourgeoisie, old money, big finance, industry chiefs like the Rothschilds or Schneiders.
Living the high life in Paris?
Absolutely. Mansions, servants, exclusive clubs like the Jockey Club, grand parties, lots of leisure time. That's the image that fuels the Belle Époque myth. Even their sports tennis, mountaineering were about status.
Okay, let's look at the working class again. About a third of the workforce.
Roughly, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe 4.5 to 6 million people. Very diverse group, factory workers, artisans, miners. But conditions were generally brutal.
Long hours.
Incredibly long. 12 hours was common. Sometimes way more coachmen might work 17 hours. People died young from exhaustion and accidents. There were some social laws, accident compensation in 98, a limited pension in 1910, weekly rest day from 1906. But France lagged behind Britain or Germany.
And wages weren't keeping up.
Actually, real wages fell between 1905 and 1913 because the prices were rising. That led constant strikes over 1,000 a year between 1906 and 1910.
Were unions strong?
Not really. Union membership was low, maybe 9% in 1913. But groups like the CGT Union Federation, founded 1895, were pretty militant, and strikes could be met with force. The 1907 electrician strike in Paris saw deaths and injuries.
What about women in all this? Still very unequal.
Oh, profoundly unequal. Legally, women depended on their husbands, couldn't control their own wages until 1907. The ideal was the housewife, even for working-class women if they could manage it.
But were things starting to change? Emancipation?
Definitely seeing the first signs, yes. Education was key. Ferry's laws meant primary school for girls. The Camille Say law created girls' high schools in 1880.
So more opportunities opening up.
Slowly. More women went to university, though still a small number. You had pioneers like Marie Curie Nobel Prizes, first woman professor at the Sorbonne. Early female lawyers started appearing. New jobs opened up in offices, department stores, teaching.
And feminism as a movement was growing?
Yes, gaining momentum. Groups like the National Council of French Women formed in 1901. Feminist newspapers like Le Fronde were started by women like Marguerite Durand. It was bubbling up.
And then there's the whole issue of prostitution, which was quite visible then.
Very visible and regulated by the state. It was a huge spectrum, from absolute misery on the streets to the incredibly lavish lives of the top courtesans, the demi-mondaines like La Belle Otero, another stark contrast.
Fascinating. What about religion? You mentioned secularization earlier. Was faith declining?
Religious practice definitely was, particularly in cities and among workers, even if most people were still baptized Catholic. That 1905 separation law was the big turning point, seen as persecution by some Catholics, which, as we said, sometimes tied into anti-Semitism.
What about other groups? Protestants?
A small minority, but influential. Generally strong supporters of the Republic. And you also have the rise of secular free thought societies, actively promoting non-religious views.
And one last thing on society. Crime. Was there a sense of rising insecurity?
There was definitely a perception of rising crime, even if the stats are complex. You saw new kinds of crime like the Bonnat gang using cars for robberies. They were called tragic bandits.
Like something out of a movie.
Right. And worries about youth crime. These Apache gangs in Paris, linked to idleness and alcoholism.
The pressure to modernize the police.
Exactly. Figures like Célestin Hennion and Prefect Lapine brought in changes.
Oh.
Police on bicycles, the Hirondelle, using new forensic techniques, photography, fingerprinting, trying to keep up.
Okay, let's shift gears completely, because amidst all this tension and inequality, there was this incredible explosion of culture, science, technology.
Oh, absolutely. This is where the bell really comes into its own. It was the golden age of the press.
Why then specifically?
Literacy was way up thanks to those Ferry laws nearly everyone could read. Plus, the 1881 law guaranteed press freedom. Add new tech like linotype machines, fast rotary presses, boom. Mass media.
How big are we talking?
Daily newspaper circulation hit 12 million before 1914. Le Petit Parisien sold 1.5 million copies a day.
Incredible. And lots of different kinds of papers.
Huge diversity. Popular dailies, serious papers, Political ones like Laurent, which published Zola the Chickateus, or Jean Jaurès, a socialist paper, L'Humanité. The term intellectual really came into use then for writers and scientists engaging in public debate.
And reading became more widespread generally.
Yes, a real democratization of reading. Popular novels took off Arsène Lupin, Fantomas, and literary prizes like the Goncourt 1903 and Femina 1904 were established, shaping the literary landscape.
And Paris itself, a magnet for artists.
Absolutely, global hub. You had Art Nouveau bursting out everywhere. Hector Guimard's metro entrances are the iconic example, right?
Instantly recognizable. And painting, still Impressionism.
Impressionism was still huge.
Yeah.
Monet was painting his water lilies. But you had revolutionary new movements emerging. Cubism with Picasso and Braque. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon basically launched it. And Fauvism, led by Matisse with those wild colors. They were tearing up the rule book.
What about other arts? Sculpture.
Dominated by Rodin. He had his own pavilion at the 1900 Exposition, which really cemented his fame. Theater was thriving too. Stars like Sarah Bernhardt, popular comedies by Feydeau,
Their music? Debussy? Ravel?
breaking new ground. And then the ballet Russes arrived in Paris, bringing Stravinsky. His Rite of Spring caused a riot at first, but it made Paris the center of the musical avant-garde.
It really feels like a cultural whirlwind. And technologically, too, you mentioned the Second Industrial Revolution, electricity and cars.
Those were the big drivers. Electricity changed everything in cities. Street lights replaced gas lamps. Illuminated signs popped up. That's how Paris became the City of Light. The Palace of Electricity at the 1900 Expo was this huge symbol of its power.
And science was making huge leaps.
Groundbreaking discoveries. French scientists won multiple Nobels. Becquerel discovered radioactivity in 96. Pierre and Marie Curie isolated radium in 98. These weren't just incremental advances. They fundamentally changed physics and medicine.
And new ways to have fun were emerging, too. Cinema.
Yes. The Lumiere brothers patented their cinematograph in 1895, held the first public screening in Paris. Georges Méliès was pioneering special effects. A trip to the moon is amazing even now. People like Pathé and Gaumont turned it into an industry, making newsreels too.
So people could see current events on screen.
Exactly. And sports became huge, not just for the rich. Spectator sport was born. The first Tour de France was 1903. Rugby and football international started. Paris even hosted the Olympics in 1900, though it wasn't a big deal then, interestingly. But women competed for the first time.
And just Parisian life generally, cafes, cabarets.
The absolute epicenter of entertainment. Grand cabarets like the Moulin Rouge, the Folies Bergère, places where different classes could actually mix. Music halls, fairs. Even workers had a bit more leisure time for things like cycling or just a Sunday walk.
And that 1900 Universal Exposition seems like the climax of it all.
It really was. A kind of summary of the 19th century's achievements. Almost 50 million visitors. It literally reshaped parts of Paris. The Pont Elizon to the Third Bridge, the Grand and Petit Palais, the Gare d'Orsay train station.
Now a museum. And the metro opened then, too.
Right during the Expo, July 19th, 1900. Line 1. A massive engineering challenge led by Fulgence Bienvenu. They used amazing techniques sinking caissons under the Seine, even freezing the ground for tunnels. And those iconic white tiles in the stations. That was innovative design to reflect the dim electric light.
Wow. It really cemented Paris as this symbol of modernity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Expo, the metro, the rise of cars, bicycles becoming common, 3.5 million bikes by 1913. It all contributed to this feeling of speed, progress, new freedoms.
Okay, so we have this incredibly vibrant yet deeply divided picture. How has our understanding of the Belle Époque changed over time, the historiography?
Well, that popular romantic image really solidified after World War II in the 1950s. France's global power was fading, so looking back at the triumphant republic was a way to boost national pride. It showed up in textbooks, films, everywhere.
But then came a shift, more critical views.
Yeah, in the 1960s. As France modernized rapidly, historians started focusing more on the conflicts, the inequalities, the stuff hidden beneath the glitter. People who lived through it started sharing memories in the 70s, often describing a pretty ruthless society.
So a more complex picture emerged.
Exactly. And more recently, historians have looked beyond just Paris and the elite. They've brought in stories from the provinces, from rural areas, from artisans. People like Duracell or Winnock offer a much more balanced view, now acknowledging the real progress, but not ignoring the hardships.
Which is why it still fascinates us, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. It keeps showing up in films, books, exit orphans. We're still trying to understand that mix of light and shadow.
So if we were to sum it up, the Belle Époque, genuinely transformative, full of progress, innovation, amazing culture.
But also deeply unequal. politically tense with real anxieties under the surface. Beautiful for some, yes, but definitely not for everyone.
It laid so many foundations for our modern world, didn't it?
Without a doubt. Its blend of achievement and contradiction is why it still grabs our imagination.
And maybe a final thought for everyone listening. If this was a time of peace, of apparent carefree living, that allégresse de vivre, how much of that was maybe a collective turning away, a distraction from past traumas like the 1870 defeat, or from the storm clouds gathering for World War I?
That's a provocative question.
Yeah.
Was all that brilliance just a kind of frantic energy before everything went dark? Something to ponder?
Definitely food for thought.
And hopefully this has sparked your curiosity to look deeper into specific things, maybe Art Nouveau, early cinema, the lives of workers. There's so much more to explore in this fascinating era.